They surrounded me on my own front porch, demanding to know why I was receiving packages at their address, laughing when I tried to explain I lived here, whispering about calling the police on the suspicious woman who clearly didn't belong in their neighborhood. One even started recording, claiming I was probably running some kind of scam. And then the UPS driver stepped out of his truck. That's when everything stopped, because the way he looked at me wasn't confusion, it was recognition. And the words that came out of his mouth made those neighbors realize they had no idea who they were dealing with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, back to it. I never expected moving to Maplewood Grove would feel like entering enemy territory, but standing on my own front porch that Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by neighbors who decided I didn't belong there, I was getting flashbacks to patrols in hostile villages where every face was a potential threat. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I just wanted to receive a package in peace. At 52, I thought my days of having to prove myself to people who'd already made up their minds about me were over. I was wrong. The house at 847 Elmwood Drive had been my sanctuary for 3 months now. A modest two-story colonial with faded blue shutters and a front porch that needed repair, nestled in a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured and the mailboxes matched. It wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. The first place I'd ever owned that didn't come with deployment orders and an expiration date. I'd moved here from a cramped apartment near Fort Benning, carrying 2 duffel bags and a lifetime of service records that most people weren't cleared to read. The VA counselor had suggested somewhere quiet, somewhere I could decompress and figure out what civilian life was supposed to look like. Maplewood Grove seemed perfect on paper. Affordable, peaceful, the kind of place where people minded their own business. Except apparently they didn't. The trouble started small, the way these things usually do. Neighbors who forgot to wave back when I said good morning. Conversations that stopped when I walked by. Sideways glances when I picked up my mail. I told myself it was normal adjustment period stuff, that people needed time to warm up to newcomers. But then came the package delivery issues. First, it was my neighbor at 845, Janet Morrison, a woman in her 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She knocked on my door one evening holding a package addressed to me that had been delivered to her by mistake. "I think there's been some confusion," she said, not quite meeting my gaze. "This has your name on it, but our mail carrier mentioned you might be temporary. Just wanted to make sure this gets to the right person." I thanked her for bringing it over, explained that I lived here now, and thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, it was Tom Bradley from across the street. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd probably played high school football and never stopped talking about it. He approached me while I was watering the small garden I'd started in my front yard, holding another misdelivered package. "Hey there," he said, his tone friendly but his eyes calculating. "Got another one of your packages. Starting to think there might be some kind of address mix-up happening. You sure you're supposed to be receiving mail here?" I straightened up from my tomato plants, keeping my voice level. "I live here, Mr. Bradley, 847 Elmwood Drive, same as the address on the package." He looked at the house like he was seeing it for the first time, then back at me. Right. It's just the previous owners, the Hendersons, they moved to Florida about 6 months ago. We all kind of knew each other around here, community watch type thing. Just want to make sure everything's on the up and up." I understood what he was really saying. They'd known the previous owners, and I didn't fit whatever picture they had in their heads of who belonged in the Henderson house. The fact that I was a black woman living alone in a neighborhood that was whiter than fresh snow probably didn't help. But I dealt with worse assumptions in worse places. I thanked him politely and went back to my gardening. The third incident happened on a Saturday morning. I was coming back from my usual 5-mile run, still in my worn Army PT shirt and shorts, when I found Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez from next door standing on my porch examining the address numbers painted beside my front door. She was younger than Morrison and Bradley, maybe early 40s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested she spent considerable time and money on her image. Designer athletic wear, perfect makeup, even for a weekend morning, the works. "Oh, hello," she said when she saw me approaching, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to say something unpleasant but want to sound reasonable. There's been some confusion with package deliveries lately. Several of us have been getting mail and packages for this address, and we're trying to figure out what's going on." I slowed to a walk, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that came when I sensed a situation about to go sideways. What kind of confusion? Well, packages addressed to someone named Sarah Johnson, but none of us know any Sarah Johnson, and the delivery drivers keep insisting this is the right address, even though she gestured vaguely at me, like my presence on my own porch required explanation. "I'm Sarah Johnson," I said simply. "I live here." She blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "Oh, but the Hendersons lived here for 15 years. We all knew them. Nice family. And now suddenly there are all these packages and deliveries and now I live here," I finished. "Bought the house in June. Been here 3 months." Something in her expression shifted, and I recognized the look. It was the same one I'd seen on the faces of soldiers who just realized they'd walked into an ambush. Like she'd expected me to apologize or explain myself, and my refusal to do so had thrown off her entire script. "Of course," she said, but her smile was strained. "It's just that we like to keep track of things in the neighborhood, for security purposes, you understand." I understood perfectly. I also understood that this conversation was heading somewhere I didn't want it to go, so I politely excused myself and went inside. But I could feel her watching me through my front window as I moved around my living room. The next few weeks brought more of the same. Packages delivered to neighbors who seemed increasingly reluctant to bring them over. Questions about whether I was sure I had the right address. Suggestions that maybe I should contact the post office to sort out the confusion. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was expecting a delivery from the VA, some routine paperwork related to my disability benefits. It was supposed to be a simple drop-off, the kind of thing that happened thousands of times a day across the country without incident. I should have known better. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book and enjoying the quiet when I heard voices outside. Not the normal neighborhood sounds of kids playing or lawnmowers running, but the kind of low, intense conversation that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked out my front window and saw them gathered on the sidewalk in front of my house. Morrison, Bradley, Vasquez, and 2 other neighbors I recognized but had never spoken to. They were standing in a loose circle, talking among themselves and occasionally glancing toward my house. Then I saw the UPS truck turning onto Elmwood Drive, and I knew whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be good. I stepped onto my front porch as the brown truck pulled up to the curb. The driver was a young man, maybe late 20s, wearing the standard brown uniform and carrying a tablet. He checked his screen, looked at my house numbers, and started walking up my front walkway with a package in his hand. That's when my neighbors moved. "Excuse me," Morrison called out, intercepting him halfway up my walk. "There's been some confusion with deliveries to this address." The driver stopped, looking confused. "Ma'am?" "This package," she gestured toward the box in his hands, "it's addressed to someone named Sarah Johnson, but there's no Sarah Johnson living at this address. We're the neighbors, and we know everyone who lives on this street." Bradley stepped forward, crossing his arms. "This has been going on for months now. Packages, mail, all kinds of deliveries for someone who doesn't live here. We think there might be some kind of fraud happening." "Or identity theft," Vasquez added, pulling out her phone. "Maybe we should call the police, just to sort this whole thing out." I stood on my porch, watching this surreal scene unfold on my own front lawn. These people were literally preventing a delivery driver from bringing me my mail on my property while suggesting I was some kind of criminal. The driver looked between them and me, clearly unsure what to do. His training probably covered a lot of situations, but probably not neighbors staging an intervention over package delivery. "Look," he said, consulting his tablet again, "this package is addressed to Sarah Johnson at 847 Elmwood Drive. That's this address, and there's the lady standing right there." He pointed at me. "But she doesn't live here," Morrison insisted. "The Hendersons lived here for 15 years. We know who belongs in this neighborhood." And there it was, the thing that had been lurking under all the polite questions and concerned suggestions. The real reason why my packages kept getting questioned and my presence kept getting challenged. I belonged in their neighborhood about as much as I'd belonged in a lot of places I'd served, which was to say, not at all, according to people who decided what belonging looked like before they'd ever met me. I took a step forward, and every eye turned to me. "That's my package," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "I'm Sarah Johnson, and I live at 847 Elmwood Drive, have for 3 months now." "Anyone can claim to be anyone," Bradley said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "How do we know you're not just picking up packages for someone else or running some kind of scam?" "What kind of scam?" I asked. "Identity theft? Mail fraud? Who knows?" Vasquez said, waving her phone. "That's why we should call the police. Let them sort it out." The driver looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said to me, "can you show some ID just to confirm the delivery?" I felt that familiar burning in my chest, the same feeling I'd gotten countless times over the years when people decided I needed to prove I belonged somewhere. In mess halls where I was the only woman, in briefing rooms where I was the only black face, in leadership positions where people assumed I was someone's assistant instead of someone's commanding officer. But I'd learned long ago that sometimes you have to play the game to win the war. So I pulled out my driver's license and handed it to the delivery driver. He looked at it, looked at the package, looked at my house numbers, and nodded. "Everything checks out. Sarah Johnson, 847 Elmwood Drive." "Let me see that," Bradley demanded, reaching for my license. That's when something in my expression must have changed, because he stopped mid-reach and took a step back. "I don't think so," I said quietly. "There's no need to be hostile," Morrison said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they want to make you the unreasonable one. "We're just trying to protect our neighborhood." "From what?" I asked. "From irregularities," she said vaguely. "Things that don't add up." I looked at these 5 people standing on my front lawn, blocking a delivery driver from doing his job, questioning my right to receive mail at my own address, and threatening to call the police because they'd decided I was suspicious. I thought about all the things I could say, about the house deed with my name on it, about the mortgage payments coming out of my bank account, about the 25 years I'd spent defending the freedom they were using to harass me. Instead, I just stood there and waited for the other shoe to drop. "Ma'am," the driver said, stepping toward my porch with the package, "I need to complete this delivery." "Hold on," Bradley said, moving to block his path. "We haven't finished sorting this out." "You don't get to sort anything out," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I'd intended. "This is my property, that's my package, and you're trespassing." "Trespassing?" Vasquez laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "We live here. You're the one who doesn't belong." And there it was, finally out in the open. The thing they'd been dancing around for 3 months. I didn't belong. Not in their neighborhood, not in their community, not in the neat little picture they had of who got to call Maplewood Grove home. The delivery driver looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "Look, folks, I just need to deliver this package and get back to my route. Can we please?" "Not until we figure out what's really going on here," Morrison said firmly. "For all we know, she's not even supposed to be living in that house." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. "It means," Bradley said, stepping closer to my porch, "that decent people don't just show up in established neighborhoods and start causing problems." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were surprising, but because they were so familiar. How many times had I heard variations of the same theme? That I didn't fit.
that I was causing problems just by existing in spaces where people like me weren't expected. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, felt that old familiar rage building in my chest. The same rage that had gotten me through basic training when drill sergeants tried to break me. The same rage that had carried me through deployments where I had to prove myself every single day. The same rage that had sustained me through 25 years of being the only, the first, the unexpected. But before I could say anything, before this situation could escalate into something that would definitely end with police cars and incident reports, I heard the distinctive rumble of another truck engine. Everyone turned to look as a second UPS truck came around the corner and pulled up behind the first one. The driver who got out was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors. He took one look at the scene in front of my house, his fellow drivers surrounded by agitated neighbors, everyone standing in tense confrontation, and his expression shifted to something I recognized. It was the look of someone who'd been in similar situations before and knew how to read the terrain. He walked up to the group with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what he was dealing with, his eyes moving systematically from face to face before settling on me. And that's when I saw the recognition hit him like lightning. His back straightened, his shoulders squared. His entire posture shifted from casual delivery driver to something else entirely, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Because I knew that look. I'd seen it in mirrors for 25 years. The older driver looked at me standing on my porch, looked at the neighbors surrounding his colleague, looked at the package being held hostage by people who decided I didn't belong, and his jaw tightened. "Problem here, Jackson?" he asked the younger driver, but his eyes never left mine. "These folks are questioning the delivery address," Jackson replied, clearly relieved to have backup. "Package for Sarah Johnson at this address, but they're saying she doesn't live here." The older driver nodded slowly, then looked directly at me.
"Ma'am, would you mind stepping down here for a moment?" I hesitated. Every instinct I'd developed over decades of dealing with hostile situations told me to be careful, to stay on high ground, to keep my defensive position. But something in this man's demeanor, something in the way he carried himself, made me trust him. I walked down my porch steps and across my front yard, my neighbors parting reluctantly to let me through. The older driver met me halfway, and when he got close enough to read the faded lettering on my old PT shirt, his entire expression changed. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the kind of intensity that made my skin prickle. Then he glanced at my posture, my bearing, the way I held myself even in this ridiculous situation. Finally, he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone else go silent. "Could you state your full name for the record?" "Sarah Elizabeth Johnson," I replied, not sure where this was going but willing to play along. He nodded once, then did something that made my heart skip a beat and the neighbor's jaws drop. He came to attention and snapped off a crisp salute. "Commander Johnson," he said, his voice ringing across my front yard like a bell. "Classified delivery, ma'am." The silence that followed that salute was deafening. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful neighborhood afternoon, but the kind of silence that comes when everyone's understanding of reality suddenly shifts beneath their feet. I felt my own back straighten instinctively, muscle memory taking over as I returned the salute with the precision that had been drilled into me thousands of times. "At ease, Sergeant," I said, recognizing the bearing and the respect that only came from someone who'd served. The older driver relaxed slightly but maintained his professional posture. "Sergeant First Class Martinez, am. 22 years, 3rd Infantry Division. Retired now, obviously, but some things you don't forget." "No, they don't," I agreed, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions running through my head. What gave it away? Martinez glanced at my neighbors, who were standing frozen like someone had hit a pause button on their entire world. "Bearing, ma'am.
The way you carried yourself when these folks were giving you trouble. Plus, that shirt you're wearing. It's old issue but well maintained. And your response time to commands, the way you returned that salute. You don't fake that kind of training. Morrison found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. Commander? I looked at her, this woman who'd spent 3 months questioning my right to exist in her neighborhood, and felt a mixture of anger and something that might have been pity. Commander Sarah Elizabeth Johnson, United States Army. Retired. But Bradley started, then seemed to realize he was about to step on a landmine and stopped himself. I'm what? I asked quietly. He had the grace to look ashamed, his face flushing red as he struggled for words that wouldn't make things worse. I didn't. You didn't expect what, exactly? My voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. The same steel that had gotten me through command positions in 3 different combat zones, through congressional hearings where politicians tried to undermine my recommendations, through promotion boards where some people thought women like me didn't belong in leadership roles. Vasquez stepped forward, her phone still in her hand but no longer recording. We had no idea. You never said anything about being in the military. Why would I? I replied. Is that a requirement for receiving mail in this neighborhood? Military service verification? The younger UPS driver, Jackson, was still holding my package and looking like he'd stumbled into something way above his pay grade. Martinez noticed his confusion and gestured for him to approach. Jackson, go ahead and complete that delivery. The lady's been waiting long enough. Jackson practically sprinted to my porch, set the package down by my front door, and hurried back to his truck. Smart kid. He recognized when it was time to make himself scarce. Martinez, however, wasn't going anywhere. He turned to face my neighbors with the kind of expression that had probably terrified junior enlisted soldiers for 2 decades. Now then, he said, his voice carrying enough authority to make grown adults want to stand at attention, would someone like to explain to me why a retired Army commander can't receive a package at her own home without being harassed by the welcoming committee? Morrison opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. We didn't know. She never told us she was in the military. And why should she have to? Martinez asked. Last I checked, this was still America, where people don't have to justify their existence to their neighbors. It's not like that, Bradley protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We were just concerned about security in the neighborhood, all these packages and deliveries, and we didn't know who she was. You didn't know who she was because you never bothered to find out, Martinez said bluntly. You made assumptions instead of making introductions. You saw someone who didn't fit your picture of what this neighborhood should look like, and you decided she must be the problem. I watched this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. It felt good to have someone defend me, especially someone who understood the weight of what that uniform had meant. But I'd been fighting my own battles for so long that having someone else step in felt strange. Sergeant Martinez, I said quietly, and he immediately turned to give me his full attention. I appreciate your support, but I can handle this. Of course, ma'am. Just wanted to make sure these folks understood the situation. I nodded, then turned to face my neighbors. 5 people who'd spent months treating me like an intruder in my own neighborhood, who'd just discovered they'd been harassing a retired military officer. The shame on their faces was obvious, but I wasn't sure if it was genuine remorse or just embarrassment at being caught. Let me ask you something, I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen. What exactly did you think was going to happen here today? You were going to prevent a delivery driver from doing his job, call the police on me for receiving mail at my own address, and then what? I'd just disappear? Move away because you'd decided I didn't belong? We weren't trying to, Morrison started, but I held up a hand. You were trying to exactly that. You wanted me gone. You wanted this problem, which is what you saw me as, to just go away. And when I didn't cooperate with your plan, you escalated. You involved other people in your harassment. You made a public scene on my front lawn. Vasquez had tears in her eyes now, though I wasn't sure if they were from guilt or frustration. "We were scared," she said quietly. "There have been break-ins in other neighborhoods, and when we didn't know who you were." "You were scared," I repeated. "Of what? A middle-aged woman tending her garden? Someone who waves good morning and minds her own business? What exactly about my behavior has been threatening?" The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. They weren't scared of my behavior. They were scared of me, of what I represented.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Of the change my presence brought to their comfortable, predictable world. Bradley cleared his throat. "Commander Johnson, we owe you an apology. A big one. We handled this all wrong." "Yes, you did," I agreed. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it going forward?" Martinez was still standing at attention, and I could see the younger UPS driver watching from his truck, probably taking mental notes for a story he'd be telling for years. This wasn't just about a package delivery anymore. This was about the kind of community these people wanted to live in and the kind of neighbor they wanted to be. "Can you tell us," Morrison asked hesitantly, "what branch of service and for how long?" I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine interest or just morbid curiosity. "Army, 25 years. I started as an enlisted soldier and worked my way up to battalion command." "What did you do?" Bradley asked. "I led soldiers," I said simply, "in training and in combat. I made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. I signed orders that sent people into dangerous situations and brought them home safely. I testified before Congress about military readiness and resource allocation. I managed budgets larger than this entire neighborhood's annual income." The weight of those words settled over the group like a blanket. These were people who'd questioned my right to live on their street, and they were learning that I'd commanded more authority and responsibility than they'd probably ever imagined. "Where did you serve?" Vasquez asked quietly. "Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, plus domestic assignments at Fort Bragg, the Pentagon, and Fort Leavenworth." I paused, watching their faces process this information. The house at 847 Elmwood Drive is the first home I've ever owned that wasn't temporary. The first place I could call mine without knowing I'd have to leave it in 2 years for another assignment. Martinez nodded approvingly. "That's the dream for most of us, ma'am, finding that place where you can finally put down roots." "Exactly, and I chose this neighborhood because it seemed peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where people minded their own business and let their neighbors do the same." The implications of that statement weren't lost on anyone. I'd thought I was moving somewhere I could finally relax, and instead, I'd found myself under constant scrutiny and suspicion. "We made you feel unwelcome," Morrison said, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine remorse. "Yes, you did." "How do we fix this?" Bradley asked. It was a fair question, and I appreciated that he'd asked it, but it wasn't a simple answer. You can't unring a bell, and you can't unhurt someone who's been made to feel like they don't belong. Trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt from the ground up. "I don't know if you can," I said honestly. "Relationships are built on mutual respect, and for 3 months, you've shown me none. You've questioned my integrity, my honesty, my right to exist in this space. You've made assumptions about who I am based on what I look like, and you've acted on those assumptions in ways that affected my daily life." Martinez was nodding along with every word. "In the military, we call that a failure of leadership, when you make decisions based on incomplete information and let your biases drive your actions." "But people can change," Vasquez said desperately. "We can do better." "Can you?" I asked. "Because this isn't just about me. Someday, another new neighbor is going to move in who doesn't look like what you expect. Someone whose background you don't immediately understand. Someone who doesn't fit your definition of who belongs here." The question seemed to hit them like a physical blow. Because they knew, and I knew, and Martinez knew, that this wasn't really about package deliveries or address confusion. This was about prejudice dressed up as community concern.
This was about people who'd decided that different meant dangerous and who'd been willing to act on that assumption. "We need to examine our own behavior," Morrison said slowly. "Our own assumptions." "Yes, you do," I agreed. "And you need to ask yourselves why you were so quick to assume the worst about someone you'd never even tried to get to know." Martinez checked his watch and glanced toward his truck. "Ma'am, I hate to interrupt, but I've got a schedule to keep. Is there anything else you need from me?" I looked at this man who'd appeared at exactly the right moment and turned a humiliating situation into something approaching justice. "Thank you, Sergeant Martinez. Your intervention was timely." He smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Just looking out for one of our own, ma'am. Military family takes care of each other." "That we do." He snapped off another salute, which I returned, then headed back to his truck. As he drove away, I was left standing on my front lawn with 5 neighbors who were seeing me clearly for the first time. "Commander Johnson," Bradley said carefully, "would you be willing to let us try again? To start over?" I considered the question seriously. These people had spent months making my life difficult, questioning my presence, and treating me like a threat. They'd humiliated me in front of delivery drivers and threatened to call police on me for the crime of receiving mail. The hurt they'd caused wasn't going to disappear just because they'd learned something that made them respect me. But I'd also spent 25 years in an institution that believed in second chances, in the possibility of growth and change. I'd seen soldiers overcome their worst instincts and become better people. I'd seen enemies become allies when circumstances changed their perspective. "I'm willing to consider it," I said finally. "But it can't just be words. Actions matter more than apologies." "What would you need to see?" Morrison asked. "Treat the next new neighbor better than you treated me," I said. "Don't make assumptions. Ask questions instead of spreading suspicions. Remember that people's worth isn't determined by how well they fit your expectations." Vasquez wiped her eyes. "We will. I promise we will." "And maybe," I added with a slight smile, "you could stop intercepting my packages. The UPS drivers are starting to think this neighborhood is some kind of security risk." That got a few nervous laughs, which felt like progress. "There's something else," Bradley said hesitantly. "The neighborhood association is having a block party next month for Halloween. Would you
consider coming? As our guest?" I raised an eyebrow. "As your guest? It's my neighborhood too." "Right, of course, that came out wrong. Would you like to join us? We'd love to have you there." I thought about it. 3 months ago, when I'd first moved to Elmwood Drive, I would have jumped at the chance to attend a neighborhood gathering. It would have been exactly the kind of community connection I'd been hoping for. But 3 months of suspicion and hostility had changed things. "I'll think about it," I said finally. And with that, the crowd on my front lawn began to disperse. Morrison lingered for a moment. "Commander Johnson," she said quietly, "I want you to know that what we did was wrong. Not just misguided or mistaken, wrong. And I'm going to work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen again." I studied her face, looking for signs of sincerity versus social obligation. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Morrison." "Janet. Please, call me Janet." "Janet, I'm Sarah." She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah. Finally, properly meet you." As she walked away, I climbed the steps to my front porch and picked up the package that had started this whole confrontation. It was from the VA, just routine paperwork about my benefits. Nothing exciting or mysterious or worthy of the drama it had caused. I sat down on my front porch swing and opened the package, watching the neighborhood return to its normal rhythms. Kids playing in yards, lawnmowers humming, the ordinary sounds of suburban life. But something had shifted in the last hour. The dynamic had changed in ways that couldn't be unchanged. For 3 months, I'd been the outsider, the problem, the question mark in their comfortable equation. Now they knew who I was, and more importantly, they knew that their assumptions about me had been completely wrong. That knowledge would change how they saw me, but it would also change how they saw themselves. I thought about Martinez and his intervention, about the way a simple salute had transformed the entire situation. Military recognition was powerful like that. It carried weight and commanded respect in ways that civilian accomplishments often didn't. But it also bothered me that it had taken a uniform, even a remembered one, to make these people see my worth. Would they have treated me differently if I'd been a retired teacher, a former nurse, a social worker who'd spent decades helping others? The honest answer was probably not. There was something about military service that carried special weight in American society, a kind of automatic respect that other forms of public service didn't always receive. But I was grateful for Martinez's intervention, regardless of the complexities it raised. He'd appeared at exactly the right moment and done exactly what needed to be done. Sometimes that's how things work. The right person shows up at the right time and changes everything. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and smiled. It was from my daughter Lisa, who was stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado. "Hey Mom, how's civilian life treating you? Still adjusting to the pace?" I looked around at my neighborhood, at the house I owned, at the porch swing where I could sit and watch the sunset without wondering if I'd be here tomorrow. Then I thought about the confrontation that had just ended and the relationships that might be beginning. "It's interesting," I texted back. "Definitely not boring." Because that was the truth. Civilian life was different from military life in ways I was still discovering. The rules were different, the hierarchies were murkier, and the missions were less clearly defined. But the fundamental challenges were often the same: building trust, earning respect, finding your place in a community that might initially welcome you. I'd spent 25 years leading soldiers in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. Surely I could figure out how to be a good neighbor in suburban Ohio. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across Elmwood Drive. Tomorrow would bring another day, another chance to build something better than what had come before. And for the first time since I'd moved to Maplewood Grove, I was actually looking forward to it. The changes started small, the way real change usually does. The next morning, when I stepped outside to retrieve my newspaper, Janet Morrison was already at her mailbox. Instead of the hurried wave and averted eyes I'd grown accustomed to, she walked over to the property line between our yards. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, and her voice carried none of the forced politeness I'd heard before. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, studying her face for signs of performance versus genuine effort. "How are you this morning, Janet?" "Better than yesterday," she said with a rueful smile. "I spent most of last night thinking about our conversation, about the assumptions I made. I'm not proud of how I behaved." I appreciated the directness. Military training had given me a low tolerance for people who danced around difficult topics instead of addressing them head-on. "What matters is what happens moving forward." She nodded. "I was wondering if you might be interested in joining our morning walking group. 3 of us meet at the park entrance at 6:30 every Tuesday and Thursday. Nothing fancy, just a couple miles through the trails." The invitation surprised me. For 3 months, I'd been running those same trails alone, passing their walking group and receiving polite nods at best. Now here was Janet extending an olive branch in the form of community inclusion. "I'd like that," I said. "Fair warning, though, I tend to keep a pretty steady pace." "We could use the challenge," she laughed. "Our current speed is more social stroll than actual exercise." As the days passed, more small gestures followed. Tom Bradley, who'd been one of the most vocal questioners of my presence, started bringing in my garbage cans when I was away. Elena Vasquez invited me to join the neighborhood book club, admitting sheepishly that they'd been discussing whether to extend the invitation for months but hadn't known how to approach me. The real test came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening that started ordinary and became anything but. I was in my kitchen making dinner and enjoying the quiet when I heard shouting from outside. Not the playful sounds of children or the good-natured calls between neighbors working in their yards, but urgent, panicked voices that immediately put me on alert. I looked out my kitchen window and saw chaos unfolding in the Vasquez backyard. Elena was standing on her patio, screaming into her phone, while her husband Carlos knelt beside their pool. Even from my window, I could see the small figure floating motionless in the water, their 4-year-old grandson, Miguel. I didn't think. 25 years of emergency response training kicked in, and I was moving before my conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. I sprinted across my backyard, vaulted the low fence between our properties, and reached the pool in seconds. Carlos had managed to pull Miguel from the water, but his panic was making him ineffective. The little boy was unconscious, his lips blue, water streaming from his mouth and nose. Carlos was patting his back frantically, begging him to wake up.
his medical knowledge overwhelmed by the terror of seeing his grandson in danger. "Carlos, step back," I said firmly, dropping to my knees beside Miguel. "Let me help." My voice carried enough authority that he moved without question, his hands shaking as he watched Miguel's head back and check his airway. Water and pool chemicals. No obvious obstructions, but he wasn't breathing. I'd done this before, unfortunately, not with children, but with soldiers who'd nearly drowned during water survival training, with local nationals who'd been pulled from rivers during flood rescues.
The fundamentals were the same, regardless of the victim's age or the circumstances. 2 rescue breaths, gentle but effective. Check for pulse, weak but present. Begin chest compressions, modified for his small frame. Count out loud to maintain rhythm and let the adults know I was working systematically, not just reacting. "Elena," I called out without taking my eyes off Miguel, "are you on with 911? "Yes, they're sending an ambulance," she replied, her voice high and strained. "Tell them we have a 4-year-old drowning victim, currently unconscious, compressions in progress. Ask for their ETA." I continued the CPR cycle, feeling for signs of response. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2 minutes, Miguel coughed violently and expelled a significant amount of water. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but alive. "That's it, buddy," I said gently, turning him onto his side in the recovery position. "You're okay. Just breathe for me." He started crying, which was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in weeks. Crying meant breathing, meant consciousness, meant brain function. Carlos immediately moved to comfort him, gathering his grandson into his arms with tears streaming down his face. "Mijo, mijo, you're okay," he whispered over and over, rocking slightly. "You're going to be fine." Elena appeared beside us, having finished with the emergency dispatcher. "They'll be here in 4 minutes," she said, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How did you know what to do?" "Military training," I said simply. "Combat lifesaver certification plus advanced first aid. You learn to respond to medical emergencies when you might be the only qualified person for miles." By now, other neighbors had begun gathering, drawn by the sirens in the distance and the obvious crisis unfolding in the Vasquez backyard. I saw Janet and Tom among them, their faces creased with concern as they took in the scene. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, taking over Miguel's care and conducting a thorough assessment. His vital signs were stable, but they recommended transport to the hospital for observation and possible respiratory treatment. As they prepared Miguel for transport, one of the paramedics approached me. "You did good work here," he said quietly. "That kid's alive because you knew what you were doing and acted fast." "Just glad I was close enough to help," I replied. Carlos overheard the exchange and walked over, his face still pale but his expression resolute. "Sarah, you saved his life. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do." "Don't think about that," I said firmly. "Focus on the fact that he's going to be fine. Kids are resilient." "How can we ever thank you?" Elena asked, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "By getting that pool fence fixed," I said with a gentle smile, "and maybe considering some swimming lessons for Miguel when he's ready." The crowd of neighbors had grown during the emergency response, and I became aware that they were all listening to this conversation, watching me interact with the Vasquez family, seeing the aftermath of what had just happened. Tom Bradley stepped forward. "Sarah, that was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" "Army combat medic training initially, then advanced certifications as I moved up in rank. Officers are expected to be prepared for medical emergencies in the field." "You've done this before," Janet observed. It wasn't a question. Different circumstances, but yes, emergency medical response was part of my job description for 25 years. After the ambulance departed and the crowd began to disperse, Elena asked if I'd like to come inside for coffee. I accepted, partly because I needed to decompress from the adrenaline rush, but mostly because I sensed she needed to talk through what had just happened. We sat in her living room, hands wrapped around warm mugs, both of us still processing the events of the last hour. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been home," she said quietly, "or if you hadn't heard us, or if you hadn't known what to do." "But I was home, and I did hear you, and I did know what to do," I replied. "That's what matters.
She was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee. "I owe you more than just thanks. I owe you an apology that's 3 months overdue. Elena." "No, please let me say this." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "When you moved in, I was one of the people questioning whether you belonged here, making assumptions about who you were based on things that had nothing to do with your character or your qualifications to be our neighbor. I waited, recognizing this as one of those moments that could go several different ways depending on how I responded. Tonight, my grandson is alive because you were exactly the neighbor we needed you to be, because you had skills and experience and training that none of the rest of us possessed, because you acted without hesitation when someone in our community needed help." She paused, wiping away fresh tears. "And I spent 3 months trying to make you feel unwelcome in the place where you chose to make your home. I'm ashamed of that, deeply ashamed." "We all make mistakes," I said gently. "What defines us is how we learn from them." "How do you forgive something like that?" she asked. "How do you move past the knowledge that your neighbors treated you badly for no good reason?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with since the package incident 3 weeks earlier. How do you rebuild trust with people who've shown you their capacity for prejudice and poor judgment? "I think about the alternative," I said finally. "I could hold on to the anger and the hurt. I could let what happened define my relationship with this neighborhood forever. But that would mean letting your mistakes control my happiness, and I refuse to give anyone that much power over my life." She nodded slowly. "That's very generous of you." "It's not generosity, it's self-preservation. I spent too many years in hostile environments to voluntarily live in one at home." Over the next few days, word of the rescue spread through the neighborhood with the efficiency that only small communities can achieve. But the story that emerged wasn't just about my medical intervention. It was about the broader implications of what had happened. Janet stopped by on Saturday morning with a casserole and a confession. "I talked to my sister last night," she said as we sat on my front porch. "Told her about what happened with Miguel, about how you saved him." "That's kind of her to be concerned," I said. "She asked me something that's been keeping me awake," Janet continued. "She asked what would have happened if we'd succeeded in driving you away, if our behavior had convinced you to move somewhere else." The question hung between us like smoke, because we both knew the answer. "Miguel would be dead," Janet said quietly. "If you hadn't been here, if we'd made you feel so unwelcome that you decided to leave, that little boy would be dead." "You can't think like that," I said, though I understood why she was torturing herself with hypotheticals. "Why not? It's true, isn't it? Our prejudice could have cost a child his life."
I didn't have a good answer for that, because she wasn't wrong. Communities are ecosystems, and every person who belongs to them brings unique skills, experiences, and capabilities. When you exclude someone based on assumptions rather than knowledge, you're potentially depriving your community of resources you might desperately need. "What I keep thinking about," Janet continued, "is how many other times this happens. How many communities miss out on the contributions of people they've decided don't belong, based on surface-level judgments." "Probably more often than we'd like to admit," I said. "It makes me wonder about my own behavior over the years. How many people I've written off before giving them a chance. How many assumptions I've made that were completely wrong." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Bradley, who was carrying what appeared to be a large poster board. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, "but I wanted to show you both something." He turned the poster board around, revealing a hand-drawn neighborhood directory. Not just names and addresses, but brief descriptions of each resident's professional background, skills, and interests. "After what happened Thursday night, I realized we don't actually know each other very well," he explained. "We wave hello and complain about property taxes, but we don't know what people do for work, what their expertise is, what they might be able to contribute in an emergency." I scanned the list, impressed by the diversity of knowledge and experience represented on our small street. A retired nurse, a former firefighter, an auto mechanic, a financial planner, a teacher who specialized in special needs children. "This is a great idea," Janet said. "I had no idea Mrs. Chen used to be an EMT."
Or that the Johnsons have a generator big enough to power half the block, Tom added. We've been living next to all these resources without even knowing it. He looked at me somewhat sheepishly. I put you down as retired military, but I realize I don't know your specific background or expertise. After Thursday night, I'm guessing there's a lot more to your story than just general service. There usually is, with most people, I said diplomatically. Would you be willing to share some details? For emergency preparedness purposes, I mean. It seems like the kind of information that could be valuable for the whole neighborhood to know. I considered the request. For 25 years, operational security had been drilled into me. You don't volunteer information about your capabilities or background unless there's a specific need to know. But these were my neighbors, and Thursday night had proven that emergency situations could arise when that knowledge might be crucial. Battalion Command, I said finally. Military Police, Combat Operations, Emergency Response Coordination. Advanced medical training, crisis management, logistics planning. I've managed everything from natural disaster relief to combat zone evacuations. Tom was writing this down, but I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed the implications. That's significant expertise, he said carefully. Most veterans have skills that translate well to civilian emergency situations, I replied. We're trained to stay calm under pressure and work with whatever resources are available. Are there other veterans in the neighborhood? Janet asked. Probably, I said. Military service is more common than people realize, but not everyone talks about it. That observation led to a broader discussion about hidden expertise and unrecognized capabilities within communities. How many people carried knowledge and skills that could benefit their neighbors, but never had the opportunity to share them because nobody thought to ask? The following Tuesday, I joined Janet's walking group for the first time. The other regular members were Lisa Park, a kindergarten teacher, and Margaret Washington, a retired social worker. The conversation during our walk was refreshingly different from the small talk I'd expected. Elena told us what you did for Miguel, Lisa said, as we navigated the trail around the small lake. That was incredible. Just the right place at the right time, I replied. Don't minimize it, Margaret said firmly. I spent 30 years in social services, and I've seen too many situations where the right person wasn't available when they were needed. Skills like yours save lives. All of our skills matter, I said. Lisa probably knows more about child development and early intervention than most pediatricians. Margaret has crisis counseling experience that could help someone through the worst day of their life. We all bring different things to the table. But some things are more immediately life-saving than others, Lisa pointed out. True, but other things prevent crises from happening in the first place. Good teaching can keep kids out of dangerous situations. Good social work can identify problems before they become emergencies. Different kinds of value, but value nonetheless. The conversation continued as we completed our circuit, touching on everything from neighborhood preparedness to community building to the importance of really knowing your neighbors. By the time we returned to the parking area, I felt something I hadn't experienced since moving to Maplewood Grove. I felt like I belonged. The Halloween block party arrived with perfect October weather and a level of community participation that surprised everyone. Tom's neighborhood directory project had evolved into a broader initiative to build stronger connections between residents, and the party became a showcase for local talents and interests. I'd debated whether to attend, but Elena's personal invitation, delivered with Miguel safely in tow and fully recovered, had settled the matter. The little boy had insisted on showing me his superhero costume, explaining in detail how superheroes save people, just like I had saved him. The party was set up in the community space at the end of our street, with each family contributing food, decorations, or activities. I brought my famous chili, a recipe I'd perfected during cold nights in forward operating bases, and was gratified to see the pot empty within the first hour. What struck me most was how different the atmosphere felt. Instead of polite distance and suspicious glances, I found myself in genuine conversations about gardening techniques to travel experiences to recommendations for local contractors. Carlos Vasquez approached me while I was helping clean up after the costume contest. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" he said. Of course. That night with Miguel, you handled the emergency like it was routine. No panic, no hesitation, just immediate action. How do you develop that kind of composure? Training and experience, I said simply. When you've dealt with life and death situations enough times, you learn to compartmentalize emotion and focus on procedure. The feelings come later, after the crisis is resolved. He nodded thoughtfully. In my medical practice, I see that with some of the emergency room staff. They can work on trauma cases all day with perfect clinical detachment, then go home and cry about a sad movie. Different situations trigger different responses, I agreed. Professional training teaches you when to engage emotionally and when to suppress it for the greater good. I've been thinking about what happened that night, Carlos continued, about how my panic made me less effective, even though I have medical training, about how your military experience prepared you for exactly that kind of crisis. Where are you going with this? I asked, curious about his direction. I've been talking to some of the other neighbors about organizing basic emergency response training for the community. CPR, first aid, crisis management. Would you be willing to help coordinate something like that? The request surprised me, but I realized it made perfect sense. Communities were stronger when more people possessed emergency skills. And it would be a way to contribute meaningfully to my neighborhood while sharing knowledge that could genuinely help people. I'd be happy to help, I said. We could reach out to the local fire department, see if they'd partner with us on training programs. That would be amazing. I think a lot of people would be interested, especially after what happened with Miguel. As the evening wound down and neighbors began packing up their contributions, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, these same people had questioned my right to receive mail at my own address. Tonight, they were asking for my help in building a safer, more prepared community. Change was possible, even when it seemed impossible. People could overcome their prejudices when confronted with evidence that challenged their assumptions. Communities could become stronger when they embraced diversity of experience and expertise. But it required work from everyone involved. It required people like Elena and Janet and Tom to examine their own behavior and commit to doing better. It required people like me to remain open to building relationships even after being hurt. It required everyone to focus on shared values rather than surface differences. As I walked home that night, my house warm and welcoming against the autumn darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years.
I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Not just my personal future, but the future of this small community I'd chosen to join. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter Lisa. "How's the neighborhood situation going? Any progress with the neighbors?" I looked around at Elmwood Drive, at houses where people now knew my name and valued my contributions, at a community where I was no longer an outsider but a respected member. "Better than I could have imagined," I texted back. Turns out, people can surprise you when you give them the chance. Because that was the truth I'd learned over the past few months. Communities weren't just collections of houses and property lines. They were networks of relationships, built on mutual respect and shared investment in each other's well-being. And when those relationships were built thoughtfully and intentionally, they could overcome even the most unpromising beginnings. Standing on my front porch, looking out at the neighborhood I could finally call home, I realized that sometimes the best victories were the quiet ones. The ones that didn't make headlines or earn medals, but changed daily life for the better. The ones that proved that understanding and respect could triumph over fear and prejudice, one conversation at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to build on what we'd created. But tonight, for the first time since moving to Maplewood Grove, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I stood in my backyard watching Elena Vasquez install the new pool safety fence we'd helped her research and select. Miguel was playing nearby under his grandmother's watchful eye, chattering excitedly about his upcoming swimming lessons with the instructor Elena had found after weeks of careful vetting. The emergency response training program Carlos and I had organized had grown beyond anything we'd originally envisioned.
What started as a simple neighborhood CPR class had evolved into a comprehensive community preparedness initiative that now served 3 adjoining subdivisions. The local fire department had praised our model and was recommending it to other residential areas throughout the county. I smiled watching Elena work, remembering the woman who'd once questioned my right to live here. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and genuine. Trust, once rebuilt, had proven stronger than the original foundation. "Sarah," Janet called from her yard next door. "The reporter from the community newsletter is here for the interview." I walked over to meet Michelle Torres, a young journalist who'd been covering our neighborhood preparedness program for the local publication. She was interested in how grassroots emergency training could strengthen community bonds beyond just safety considerations. "Commander Johnson," she said, extending her hand with a firm shake. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I've been following the success of your program, and the statistics are impressive. 15 households now certified in CPR, 10 in advanced first aid, and a communication network that connects with city emergency services." "The success belongs to the whole community," I replied. "I just helped coordinate the training. The real work was done by neighbors who committed to learning new skills and looking out for each other." "But you were the catalyst," Michelle pressed. "Without your military expertise and leadership experience, would this initiative have happened?" I considered her question carefully. "I think something would have happened eventually. Communities have a way of self-organizing when they recognize a need. Maybe it would have taken longer or looked different, but people want to feel prepared and connected to their neighbors." Tom Bradley approached us, carrying a clipboard and wearing the reflective vest that had become his unofficial uniform as our volunteer coordinator. "Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to confirm the schedule for next week's training session." "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, I confirmed. "Are we still expecting the group from Oakwood Circle?" 12 people confirmed, Tom replied, plus 3 from the Morrison Creek area who heard about the program through word of mouth. Michelle made notes as we spoke. "How has participating in this program changed your perspective on community involvement?" she asked Tom. He paused, clearly thinking about how to articulate something complex. "It made me realize how much I didn't know about my own neighbors. Not just their emergency skills, but their stories, their experiences, what they've overcome in their lives. You can live next to someone for years and have no idea who they really are." After Michelle finished her interview and left, Tom and I walked slowly back toward our respective houses. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elmwood Drive, and the familiar sounds of suburban evening routines filled the air. "Can I ask you something?" Tom said as we reached the property line between our yards. "Of course." "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if that UPS situation had gone differently? If Sergeant Martinez hadn't shown up when he did?" I'd been asked variations of this question many times over the past months, by neighbors who seemed to need to process the significance of that moment when everything changed. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way you might expect." "What do you mean?" "I don't focus on the negative possibilities, because dwelling on what might have gone wrong doesn't help anyone. Instead, I think about what we learned from it, about how quickly situations can change when people are willing to examine their assumptions and choose growth over defensiveness." Tom nodded slowly. "Elena says that night with Miguel was a turning point for her, not just because you saved him, but because it forced her to confront how wrong she'd been about you from the beginning." "We were all learning," I said diplomatically, "myself included." "What did you have to learn?" The question surprised me with its directness. I had to learn to trust again, to believe that people could change their minds and their behavior when presented with new information. Military life can make you cynical about civilian motivations, especially when your first experiences seem to confirm your worst expectations. And now I know that communities are like any other team. They function best when everyone feels valued and included, when people focus on shared goals rather than surface differences. It takes work and commitment from everyone involved, but it's possible to build something better than what existed before. A comfortable silence settled between us as we watched the neighborhood around us continue its evening routine. Children being called in for dinner, garage doors opening as commuters returned home, porch lights beginning to flicker on as daylight faded.
"Sarah," Tom said as we reached the property line between our yards. "Of course. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if that UPS situation had gone differently? If Sergeant Martinez hadn't shown up when he did?" I'd been asked variations of this question many times over the past months, by neighbors who seemed to need to process the significance of that moment when everything changed. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way you might expect." "What do you mean?" "I don't focus on the negative possibilities, because dwelling on what might have gone wrong doesn't help anyone. Instead, I think about what we learned from it, about how quickly situations can change when people are willing to examine their assumptions and choose growth over defensiveness." Tom nodded slowly. "Elena says that night with Miguel was a turning point for her, not just because you saved him, but because it forced her to confront how wrong she'd been about you from the beginning." "We were all learning," I said diplomatically. "Myself included. What did you have to learn?" The question surprised me with its directness. I had to learn to trust again, to believe that people could change their minds and their behavior when presented with new information. Military life can make you cynical about civilian motivations, especially when your first experiences seem to confirm your worst expectations. And now? Now I know that communities are like any other team. They function best when everyone feels valued and included, when people focus on shared goals rather than surface differences. It takes work and commitment from everyone involved, but it's possible to build something better than what existed before. A comfortable silence settled between us as we watched the neighborhood around us continue its evening routine. Children being called in for dinner, garage doors opening as commuters returned home, porch lights beginning to flicker on. "Sarah," Tom said finally, "I want you to know that having you here has made this a better place to live. Not just because of the safety training or the emergency skills, but because you've shown us what good neighbors can accomplish when they actually work together." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." As I headed inside to start my own dinner preparations, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me to this moment. From the humiliation of that first package delivery confrontation to the satisfaction of watching a community transform itself into something stronger and more inclusive. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Lisa, calling from Colorado as she did every Sunday evening. "Hey, Mom, how was your week?" "Productive," I said, settling into my favorite chair by the window. "We had another training session, and the participation keeps growing. I think we're making a real difference." "That's wonderful. You sound happy." I looked out at Elmwood Drive, at houses where neighbors now knew each other's names and stories, where children played safely because adults had committed to watching out for all of them, where differences in background and experience were viewed as community assets rather than suspicious anomalies. "I am happy," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was completely true. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Because that was the unexpected gift that had emerged from those difficult early months. Not just acceptance or tolerance, but genuine belonging. The kind of community connection that military families often talked about but rarely found in civilian neighborhoods. After I finished talking with Lisa, I made myself a cup of tea and returned to my spot by the window. The street was quiet now. Families settled in for the evening, porch lights casting gentle pools of illumination along the sidewalks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and